Hello, hello. I'll give everyone a moment here to connect to sound. Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1248th New Social Environment. I'm Joshua, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Katy Hessel and Katherine Bradford. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Katy Hessel is an art historian and author of The Story of Art Without Men, a Sunday Times and New York Times bestseller, and the winner of Waterstone's Book of the Year 2022. She runs the Great Women Artists, an Instagram account that has celebrated women artists since 2015, and hosts the Great Women Artists podcast, where she has interviewed over 150 artists and writers. She has curated exhibitions at Victoria Mural Gallery, Kaufman Gallery, and more, and runs the Great Women Artists residency at Palazzo Monti. This November, she will release her next book, How to Live an Artful Life, 366 Inspirations from Artists on How to Bring Creativity to Your Everyday. Our host today, Katherine Bradford, is a painter with studios in Brooklyn and in Maine. This season, she had solo shows in Tokyo, Milan, and forthcoming at her New York gallery, Canada, opening October 23rd. She also participated in group shows at David Zwirner, Vito Schnabel Gallery, and Karma, among others. Awards include a Guggenheim and a Joan Mitchell Fellowship. Katy Hessel interviewed her on the Great Women Artists podcast on April 8th, 2025. And with that, I'll turn it over to Katherine.
Thank you, Josh. Thank both you and Chloe for all the work you did to give us, Katy and myself, a chance to talk about what we love. And thank you to the Brooklyn Rail for giving us this platform. How you doing, Katy?
Hello, Catherine. It's great. I mean, the irony is that I'm actually in Brooklyn and you're not.
Welcome to Brooklyn.
Thank you. And thank you all so much
We'd
for
like to
coming.
see you there more often.
Oh, I love it here. It's so great. So great. And thank you so much to everyone on the Brooklyn Rail as well. And for all you for being here.
As you may have just guessed, Katy grew up in London and she went to school at university and to get a degree in the history of art. And it was at this time that she made a discovery that set her on this exciting path that she's been on to do the podcast and the books that have been published. Katy, can you tell us that story of how that happened?
Yes. So it's sort of begun at university and of course comes back to New York City with the our beloved artist Alice Neal, who I decided to study as part of my dissertation in my third year. And I found it very interesting looking at her life and looking at her works, and I thought they were really extraordinary. And this was about sort of 2015 or 2014 or something. And I didn't really understand how she hadn't been recognized in the way that I thought she should be. And, obviously she'd had lots of solo exhibitions, but I think, she hadn't had the Met show yet, she hadn't had the Barbican show and all these things. And I found it really interesting that during her lifetime, she was born in 1900 and died in 1984. And for those who don't know her work, she was this extraordinary painter of people. She lived in New York City from the 30s to the 80s and just painted the people who came in and out of her apartment. And she didn't get her major solo exhibition at the Whitney, and even then it was quite small, and it was quite sort of panned by the press as well, until the 1970s when she was in her 70s. And I sort of got really interested in this idea that there seemed to be this pattern of especially women artists not being recognized until right to the end of their life, or actually after they've been alive. And so this was kind of playing on my mind. And then I had this kind of epiphany in October the following year, where I went to an art fair, and I've said this many times, and I literally had this realization that I couldn't see a single artwork by a woman artist. And I looked back on myself and said, can I name 10 women artists? And the answer was no, off the top of my head. And that was kind of really quite concerning as someone who was, okay, yes, you were 21, but still someone who absolutely loved art and had spent their, whole sort of teenager going to exhibitions and things. And so I literally remember being in bed one night and I opened Instagram, as you do, and I typed in women artists and nothing appeared. And so I just said to myself, okay, well, maybe it's up to sort of educating yourself about this. And if you sort of commit to this idea of doing a post every single day, then you will actually learn something. And I didn't expect anyone to come along with me, but it's great that they have, and it's allowed me to sort of meet so many amazing people.
It was reading that quote from Linda Nochlin that you got the name for the Instagram account.
Yeah, exactly. And, Linda Naughlin's very famous essay, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists, which was published in 1971, which really was one of the catalysts for the feminist movement in the 70s when so much work was done. So many people came together, and so much progress was made. But of course, um, we're all still fighting that every day. I mean, look at the news today. And so, it was a way to sort of pay homage to her. And she's one of my heroes. Sadly, I never got the chance to meet her. But every time I meet someone in New York City, I always who knew her, I always ask them to tell me about her. Apparently, she loved a martini, which sounds great. But I love this kind of this the spirit in which I mean she would have been an absolute force to have met, in the 1970s. Not only did she write that essay, but also in 1976, along with Anne Sutherland Harris, she created this monumental exhibition that toured around the world. Called Women Artists 1550 to 1950, which was the first time that women artists, past and present then, were brought together. You could go to this exhibition and see Artemisia Gentileschi beside Georgia O'Keeffe. And I remember finding that catalogue because I live quite near the British Library in London. And, it was at the time as well, there weren't that many kind of books to hand that you could kind of go into your local bookshop and sort of buy on women artists in a kind of interesting way 10 years ago. And so I remember going to the British Library, I remember fishing out that catalogue and you know, finding out about so many amazing artists. I mean, they were kind of some were black and white reproductions, some were color, but it just excited me to think that there was this whole history that I didn't know about. And I was so excited to learn more. And it's the same when I visit lots of countries now. And, still, I'm in America right now. I'm still discovering American women artists. Or I was in Australia last year and I discovered so much of Australian art history. And so what I love about art as well is that it's just endless, it's limitless. There are so many avenues and you'll never get bored.
Josh, can you show us a picture of Katie's most well-known book? Yes. Um, I recently told a friend of mine who's not an artist and doesn't know anything about the art world about Katie's book called The Story of Art Without Men. And she said, well, is that historical or just a fantasy? And the fact is, it's historical. This this takes you right through the story of art up to the present time. So, how did you come up with that title?
So that title derives from a very famous book that I loved growing up called The Story of Art, which was by E.H. Gombrich, and it was first published in 1950, and I loved it. I had it on my shelf, and it was beautiful. It was so beautifully written. It was so accessible. If you had heard that word impressionism but weren't sure what it meant, you could go to that chapter and look it up and look at this incredible kind of, history is the most complex, non-linear thing in the world, but if when you write books, you have to kind of create some kind of story which anchors you, and so you can, perhaps deep dive and go off and make your own research. And I love this book, but I was installing this kind of 10-meter high timeline, as you do, at the Tate Modern of the last 1,000 years of women artists. And so I went to my story of art. I looked at his timeline at the back to get some ideas of who I could include, and realized that he didn't include a single woman artist in his first edition, and only in the 16th edition did he include just one. And so it was kind of a no-brainer. My editor and I spoke about it, and she was like, well, let's rewrite it.
And so I've heard you say, well, I wrote the story of art without men because he wrote the story of art without women.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of is as simple as that, in a way.
Have you ever gotten a pushback from men about your title?
I think, I mean, the thing is that this book is for absolutely everyone. And I think when, if people want to debate that, absolutely, let's talk about it. And that's what art is there to do. That's what books are there to do. But I think that when you kind of look at the statistics, they just don't lie. So it's black and white, it's actual facts. That's something I learned from the Guerrilla Girls. You know, when you just state facts to people, you can't argue with them. So something has to be done about them because if you see those facts in plain sight, then you know, time for action.
So back to your Instagram account. I think it's an incredible project to do a post as many times as you can of a woman artist. And I was very excited when I got an email from Katy and she said, "Can I come to your studio and interview you for the Great Women Artists?" Such a title. Who's not going to jump on that boat? So she came, and the whole time she sat right on the edge of her chair and gesticulated with her arms and laughed at everything I said, and I was very pleased. Thank you,
It
Katy.
was it was such a treat. I mean, that's the thing. It's sort of allowed me to meet my heroes and actually enter the studios. But I couldn't believe that you knew who I was, Kathy. You know, you're my hero. So and you said that you'd listened to the podcast before. I couldn't believe it.
I listened to that podcast so eagerly, and I learned so much. And at the end of each podcast, you say to each artist, who would you like to speak to? Woman artists, living or dead? And I thought that was fascinating, each response. And someone asked you that question, and I wasn't surprised with your answer because I've heard you speak about Artemisia so many times with such passion. Uh, tell us a story about this early woman artist.
So yeah, I mean, Artemisia Gentileschi is definitely the person I'd most like to meet. I mean, luckily I get to meet lots of my heroes, but she was an extraordinary artist working in the early 17th century in Rome. She was born in 1593. And if you, Josh, if you just go on a bit, there's some Artemisia pictures at the end, I think. And she grew up at a time when the sort of Baroque movement was starting to, I guess, kick off. And yeah, exactly. So her father was an artist. That's how she was able to become an artist because she was able to work in his studio. Because, of course, women artists faced all sorts of limitations and restrictions. But if your father was an artist, then you could learn the tricks of the trade. You could learn how to grind pigment. You could copy his works. You could, get tutoring from him. And he was a contemporary of Caravaggio, and this was Rome at the turn of the 1600s. It was a kind of dangerous but exciting and exhilarating place. And, it was also the time, a decades, century after the Reformation. And so the Northern European countries were kind of venturing off to sort of secular subjects. And the Catholic Church, almost as kind of propaganda, wanted to kind of lure people back into the church. And obviously, how do you lure people in? You tell great stories. And it's a very literate society, so you create paintings. And so, what they did was they commissioned these incredible works of these biblical tales. And they're so exciting. And what's amazing about Artemisia Gentileschi is that she really goes for it. I mean, age 17, she creates an extraordinary painting called Susanna and the Elders, which is this towering picture. I've seen it a few times in my life. I think it's about maybe sort of 1.8, 2 meters tall. And it's of the young, virtuous woman, Susanna, who's bathing in her garden when two lecherous men try and seduce her. And it's not a pretty picture at all. It's of this woman. She's kind of, batting her hand away from these sort of lecherous men who are sort of trying to snatch on her hair. And there's sort of cloudy skies up above. There's a kind of stone ledge that keeps them just apart. But she's kind of capturing this moment when, all might. What's going to happen? Are they going to, encroach on her space or not? And what Artemisia does is she paints the female perspective. She actually shows Susanna kind of with agency and turning away from them and sort of, that very famous John Berger expression, men act and women appear. She shows the woman acting, which is so exciting. And just to also, we've got this work here, Judith beheading Holofernes from 1620. She made two versions of this, one in 1612-13 and one in 1620. And she shows these kind of biblical stories from a female perspective. And I think that's what I find so interesting, is because she shows them kind of with action and this sort of exhilarating moment, but also kind of presenting us an extraordinary picture. I mean, so beautifully executed. If you look closely at this, you see the way that she's kind of tugging at his hair, the kind of tufts of hair that come through her knuckles, that kind of blade that is soaring on this guy's neck. His mouth is sort of just apart, as if he's sort of catching his last breath of life, and you see this kind of this amazing kind of red blood just seep into these silk sheets. And actually, I was at Robert Longo's exhibition at Pace Gallery yesterday, and he's done a sort of charcoal reproduction of this work, which is really interesting, along with reproductions of other photographs. And it just really interested me that, I guess male artists are now looking at the female greats, and I was very intrigued by that, just in terms of, and I'd love to ask him, like why include this work, and what is it about this work that kind of speaks to this time? I mean, Catherine, when you see a work like this, how do you feel?
Josh, can you show us the picture of the two paintings side by side? Yes, Caravaggio did the same subject. Artemisia on the left, Caravaggio on my right. Um, I love hearing you explain why Artemisia really nailed it and Caravaggio was a missed opportunity to paint something. Tell me your take on the two together.
Well, I think it's so interesting because, more people are, I mean, many people will know Artemisia's version now, especially if artists are reproducing it in galleries. But, Caravaggio is one of the most famous names in art history. And when you look at his work, when I look at this painting, I see, this slightly timid, anxious woman just about kind of refrain herself and sort of almost without kind of looking, or just kind of looking, she's sawing this blade in this man's neck, and her maidservant's sort of helping. Maybe they're ready, but the way that this Holofernes' grip is on that sort of sheet, it's as though in a moment he can leap up and and attack her or something. I mean, look at the way that even like their mouths, like her mouth is shut, she's silent, he is roaring with noise. And who is the person with agency in this picture? It's totally Holofernes. Do we know that he's about to be dead? Not really. It could very much turn at either point. But when we look at Artemisia's version, there is no question of what's going to happen, and also the truth of the biblical story, because he was murdered. And I think that is so interesting. Like, I'm so interested in the kind of disconnect between scripture, the original story, and the image that is presented. Because if, for example, we only saw Caravaggio, we're not totally sure what to happen next, especially if we couldn't read, we were illiterate or something. And actually what Artemisius does, it shows also that women have agency. Okay, they might be partaking in something quite violent here that I obviously wouldn't do in my life. But it's the fact that they are acting. And I think that's the important side of it, because when we look at art history, we're going into these temples of, the temples of art, these museums, and we're only really seeing one side of the story. So, for example, let's think about Joan of Arc or the Virgin Mary or, Mary Magdalene. If we see all these female figures from a male perspective, it skews our understanding of actually what women are capable of. And it kind of perpetuates these stereotypes that have actually infiltrated into our world today. And I think if more people saw images of women or all sorts of people being heroic. And also, Judith was saving her city. She wasn't doing it because out of spite, she was doing it for her people. And that act of heroism and what that means. And I think if we saw more people in art history and paintings and images being powerful and being heroic, then we might sort of think differently about people. One of my favorite artists is a Brooklyn-based artist, Mickalene Thomas, who talks about this idea that portraits are really powerful in the world. It's why she makes these incredibly kind of large-scale, rhinestone-encrusted, amazing paintings that kind of reinterpret compositions from 19th century French painters, and because she shows that women are capable of that too, in a way. What do you think about these works, Kathy?
This is the kind of lesson throughout Katie's book that I learned. It was very, very persuasive. And I must say, I laughed out loud when I got to the part about Dora Maar because Katie chose not to mention one word about Picasso. Dora Maar was presented as a standalone artist to be studied and viewed in her own right. The same with Frida Kahlo. The same with Francois Gillot. Francois Gillot, maybe you could, yes, this is what I want. These marvelous obituary headlines.
So if you just go to the one before, I think that's where the headline is. Um, so yeah,
Yes.
thank you very much. So I mean,
This
the thing is
infuriated you, right? You saw this.
it did, and but the thing is, it's also not hard to just write someone's story the way that, I mean, I was sort of
Rewrite.
shocked.
You rewrote the story.
I don't know, I'm just centering the women basically. But yes. So on the 6th of July or June or something in 2023, it was announced that Francois Gillot had died at the age of 101. And I saw a New York Times obituary that read, Francois Gillot, artist in the shadow of Picasso, is dead at 101. Notice anything wrong with that? An accomplished painter and memoirist in her own right, she was long his lover until she died. She was long his lover until she did what no other mistress of his had ever done. She walked out. Now, first of all, she was never his mistress. They were together. They were together for 10 years in her 20s, in her early 20s. And, this idea that someone's life would be summed up by the person who they dated in their 20s, despite the fact that they had degrees from Cambridge, they had law degrees, they had best-selling books, they were an incredible artist, they lived until 101. They hadn't even been out with that person in over 70 years. To then be sort of reduced like this, I mean, it's just kind of like laughable. And this idea that, like, oh, in her own right, as if she couldn't have done that without him. And I just think, yes, of course, this idea that, well, we have to contextualize people, but people are smart. They're not stupid. People aren't just going to click on something because it says Picasso. What if we change that narrative and we just said, this is an extraordinary artist, accomplished, best-selling this, created 1,600 paintings in her life. Oh my God, I want to find out who this person is. Came from Paris, to New York City, lived throughout wars, survived, and lived to tell the tale. I just think it's so lazy and just kind of embarrassing because I just think that, my God, if I was 101 and I was kind of defined by the person who I dated in my 20s, it's sort of insane.
May
And
that not happen, Katie.
I hope not. Anyway, but
You also had quite a fascinating story about a work of art that we all know, Duchamp's fountain, the urinal, which
yes.
you uncovered the secret past of the urinal. I don't think we have pictures of that, but I love that story. Can you tell it?
Yeah, so it's a woman called Baroness Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven, and she was this kind of like pseudo performance art. She would kind of collect junk on the streets of New York in 1910s and create what she called her kind of ready-made art, right? And obviously we know where that word came to
So,
came.
so you're saying that it was her phrase. She called them ready-made art?
Well, she made these poems called ready-made poems and ready-made art, and she would kind of say that this kind of bolt on a street, she would say that that was her art, and she used to sort of dress up in all these kind of extraordinary things. I think she would wear kind of sort of stamps on her cheeks. She would wear kind of tins for bras, all these sort of different things. And it was her performance. And it's really interesting because, I mean, you've got to think of like the kind of legacy of performance art, the legacy of the ready-made, and supposedly, as a letter that Marcel Duchamp's sister has, is that actually the urinal arm art was famously was actually encouraged, this idea to put a urinal in a gallery by Baroness Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven. Now, it's totally up for debate, but one thing that can't be denied is the fact that she was this pioneering artist who did actually make ready-made sculptures, perhaps before him, and they were friends. But I think that it's the fact that how many people have had her in their history books, and she died completely penniless. She had a very she went back to Berlin, and she had an awful later life. No one took her seriously. And I think, if the landscape had been different, and there were different people, of course artists always exist, but those who get to tell the history of art have often come from it from a particular perspective. And did they choose to ignore that, or did they just not look? I don't know. But it's the fact that actually, if we had in the past people kind of consciously making sure that these stories were rewritten. And of course, there are so many, especially kind of from the 60s and 70s onwards. But these names, they get missed out of history. Um,
Isn't there a story that she actually went to Marcel Duchamp's and left a piece called The Urinal with Armand on it?
well,
Someone-
there is this kind of story that a kind of female-looking person actually submitted that work into the exhibition that it was later rejected by. But I mean, this is from sources and letters that we can find this out. But there is no question that she was an influence on him for sure.
I'd say that the beginning of your book, The Story of Art Without Men, is full of uh, disappointing tales because many of the women artists ended up in not where we'd like them to be. So, many of them had very hard lives and and died penniless, so to speak. But then as history goes on, there's a wonderful turning point when we get to the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Then our own century, the book bursts open with a lot of power, a lot of great stories of triumphs, strong women, and so on. And what I loved, especially because every history of art course I took, the scholarly professor would timidly end where there was a lot of scholarship always. So sometimes it would be at the Impressionists, and I was dying to hear about what was happening now. I wanted to know about contemporary art. And the very brave thing that Katy did in this book is she takes it right up to the present time. Her last chapter is very wisely called Still Writing. Still Writing. If I hold this up, it's going to be backwards, but this is
No, it's
my
not.
copy of the book. Um, I think that's a brilliant way to explain that there's a lot coming forth, that times have changed, but Katy plunges in, and the very last thing she wants to tell us is, I think you call it the future masters. Is that it?
The new masters, yeah.
The new masters, the new masters. So she chooses three British painters, all of whom have fancy representation in New York, and saying that this is where the story is going to go. Um, Tell us about Flora, for example, Katy. Tell,
Um,
tell us who the three are that you picked.
well, I mean, like you said, the last chapter is called "Still Writing the Story of Art" because it's impossible to contextualize or even sort of put into books or even put into words what is happening right now. The works that are going to define today are being made at this very moment. That is so exciting. And what I'm lucky to do is do the podcast or do the Instagram so I can continue that still writing story the whole time. This book came out 3 years ago in the UK. It was written before that. And so, so much has happened that, if I was to sort of still writing, I mean, it would sort of be impossible to even sort of put it into words. But yes, the last chapter is, I wanted to choose sort of three friends of mine, three contemporaries of mine, Flora Yuknovich, Jade Farajatimi, and Smaya Critchlow. And I was very interested in them particularly. I mean, it was impossible to choose, but I wanted to sort of bookend each sort of I wanted to bookend the book with artists right at the end who sort of mirrored those who we spoke about right at the beginning. So I wanted to look at artists who are kind of working in this tradition, who are still using oil paint, who are still looking at these subjects. And why is that? Why has this sort of subject and painterly approach kind of continuously endured? And so, for example, someone like Flora is extraordinary. I mean, if anyone's in New York City, go and see her work at the Frick. It's just opened. It's in their cabinet room where they used to show their Boucher paintings of summer, autumn, winter, and spring. And what she's done, she's kind of reimagined the seasons as a kind of wallpaper or something. She's painted it beautifully on this kind of mural linen so it doesn't have this porous effect. And it's just, it's so enticing because what Flora does is she gets us to look twice at old master paintings. Because what artists like yourself, Kathy, are so good at is they're so good at getting us to look slowly. I just interviewed Megan Fontanella from the Guggenheim for my podcast, which will come out in a few months, about the artist Gabrielle Munter, who's coming to the Guggenheim. And we were talking about this idea of slow looking, and actually, if artists reward you if you spend time with them. And so, for example, what Flora does, she rewards us even more because not only do we get to look at her paintings, but we get to look at Boucher's paintings anew. We get to see her interpretations of the seasons. And I just think what she does is she gets me to sort of really think about titles for paintings, biblical stories, mythological stories, and what was really being painted in 300 years ago gets me to look at art history anew. The pair of us years ago went to the Wallace collection, which is kind of the Frick's cousin or sister in London. And the swing, Fragonard swing, which is this very famous painting, was being restored. And we got to have a look at it on like the kind of microscope. And it was just amazing because not only did we get to see the kind of the wisps and the licks and these kind of incredibly expressive strokes that you see very up close. To
They're
see,
very thickly painted, right?
yeah, absolutely. And but
Maybe with
also
a knife rather than a brush, do you think?
yeah, and actually, when you look at the fricks, the swing very closely, you actually see, that sort of pink flick on the shoe is actually just one brush, one line. And but also what she gets me to do is actually pause in front of what we're actually looking at. So, for example, the swing by Fragonard, and actually what really is going on in terms of the dynamics in this painting. Is it this kind of frivolous, very pretty, slightly kind of funny and humorous, frivolous scene, or actually is there something quite dark to it? Is there another undertone? So earlier on, we were talking about Artemisia and Caravaggio. It's like, oh well, yeah, we're looking at Judith and Holofernes, but actually, what is going on here? How have these people been presented? Who's in charge here? What's the perspective of that person or that person? And so that's why I love her work because she gets me to look closer.
Tell us slowly the difficult names of the other two.
Um, the other is Jade Farajatimi, who had an exhibition at Gagosian last year in New York, and he's had many exhibitions in London. And she is, again, she works with oil paint and oil stick, but just creates these sort of dazzling fireworks of the paintings. Like there's something about her work that when I'm witness to it, it sort of takes me to another a place. The kind of it sort of has this almost light orb-like feeling or sensation from underneath. It's like they're lit from underneath. It's the way I like to describe how painting is like kind of when you go into a cathedral and the sun is shining through the west facade of the building, and that kind of light and that kind of rose, and it kind of almost feels like it's reflecting back onto you. That's how I feel with her work. And also, she's very much inspired by the abstract expressionists, like, a conversation with Joan Mitchell, who appears halfway through the book. It's so interesting. And then the other artist is Samaya Critchlow, who again kind of looks at Victoriana, these sort of small, she makes these small, very kind of beautifully rendered oil paintings of these kind of very commanding, specifically black women in sort of Victorian interiors, and kind of makes us think about, the roles and the power structures that art history has kind of led us to believe, and what happens if we kind of flip the script and we give her the agency, and how do we kind of dare to confront her, and converse with her, who is a figure who has often kind of been secondary in paintings, or perhaps not even often there in paintings. And so these artists, they challenge art history for me, which is why I wanted to include them, because it's sort of, you get to the end of the book. Hopefully, you've learned lots of details and interesting facts about all these paintings, and you've looked closely, but you get to kind of look at these works again through the lens of these. And it's a bit like kind of a film. So there was like kind of twist at the end of the film, and you know what happens, but then actually, if you rewatch the film with that kind of contemporary lens through those artists, how do you look at it now?
Okay, so we're right up to the present time. Um, and I'm beaming into the art world that I know, which is Brooklyn and New York. And we've just heard a lot of very persuasive arguments about how women have been left out and need more of a spotlight on them and so on. Katy, what are you going to do about the fact that, well, I can say quite a number of my women friends have transitioned to being men, and quite a lot of my men friends are very intent on examining their feminine side, wearing jewelry, painting their nails. You've used the word fluid, and I think that's a great term for where we are now. But what's fascinating to me is how androgynous my art world is. Not everyone, but it's certainly there. It's certainly a factor. So that this is what I thought about as I got to the end of your book. Well, the story of art without men, but men and women as categories are being redefined, just as you have redefined the story of art.
Totally. And this idea that, I mean, I called it the Great Woman Artist 10 years ago. Would I call that, will I call it that today? Probably not. But also, the story of art without men, this idea that it was without men, also was a way to include as many genders as possible as well, in a way. And also, my goal is not for there to be a story of art without men at all. It's very much a kind of redressing something that I think wasn't there in terms of, Gombrich showing us the story of art without women. What I hope, with this book is it gets people to question everything, the story of something without this, the story of something without this. But that is no way at all to say that that's what I want going forward at all. And, if anything, I hope it opens people's eyes to all these different perspectives. Because when we have all these different perspectives, it's such a richer and greater and more inclusive and exciting society and art world. And so that's what I want.
I felt that as I turned the last pages of your book. And I thought it was so brave of you to, as an art historian, to tread into the present day, which seems so changeable, fascinating, and unpredictable, really. And there you were going, doing some predictions. I know you've just been in New York. You want to tell us about what excited you about what you saw here?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many shows on at the moment. Something I loved is Maria Berrio's exhibition at Hauser and Wirth. Maria is a friend of mine, and there is, if anyone can get to it, please do. It's free. This is it. And she's a painter, but she actually works with this Japanese rice paper that is hand dyed. And so when you go to the exhibition and you see a work like this, you can see the face and the hair is painted, but actually all the material is actually made up of torn paper. And this is hand painted paper, so there are so many different conversations and dynamics going on. And what I love about Maria's work is the fact that there's of course they're very beautiful, enticing images, but it's also about story. And she grew up in Columbia, where it was very, she lives in Brooklyn now, but obviously the where she grew up was very, in this sort of more rural part, was very different to the kind of dense the urban density of the concrete jungle that is New York. And so what she does, she kind of brings that to her work. She also brings, she's from a culture that is very kind of steeped in oral stories and folklore, and she brings that to the present day. But what I love about her work is it's not prescriptive. You're not saying, okay, well, this is kind of reimagining this and this is what we should think. What she does is she works in a way that is so kind of leaves it up to us to say, what do we think? And what I love about her work is there's this extraordinary tenderness to her work, that the kind of the expressions on her sitters' faces, the kind of the deepened thought, the reflections, it really kind of allows us to not only bring ourselves to these works and see where we fit in, but also gets us to think about everything that's going on in the world as well. And I think that's what she does. I think she gives a voice to the people who don't otherwise have it, but in a way that's not prescriptive and actually is so magic and timeless. I mean, this work even kind of reminds me of something, it's sort of a medieval scene or something you might find in the Book of Hours, but it was made in 2025. And what is that story that we're still searching? What does it mean for someone to be on a horse? What does a flag mean today in this world? What does it mean to people to gather, to look behind, all these different things? And so when I'm with her work, I find it like a theatre. I mean, first of all, oftentimes the whole series of work that you'll see in a room there will be this kind of thread throughout, but also I think each work is a kind of theatre in itself. I mean, Joan Mitchell said, music takes time to listen to. Um, a movie starts and it ends, and this idea that painting is forever, and this idea that not only can you revisit work time and time again and notice something else, but also there are endless stories in this kind of still image, which you might feel differently on a Tuesday to a Wednesday, or when you're 20 or when you're 40. And I think that's the kind of magic of art, and I think she shows me that.
I think you had some other choices too.
Yes, I saw a great exhibition at WSA, an exhibition called Duet, with lots of young artists who I'd never heard of before, some familiar faces as well. One of my favorite artists who's working in New York is Caron Davis, whose exhibition at Salon 94 I saw, I think, what was it last? I think it was in November 2023, and it was her series of Echo and Narcissus. And I'm really interested in, first of all, in dance and art, and she comes from a performance family. But also, again, it's like reinterpreting myth. What is Echo and Narcissus today? How can we reimagine that? What has our society become, etc., etc. And the way that she challenges sculpture, the history of sculpture. I mean, obviously, anatomically, these figures are evidently black. But when we think about ballet or classical sculpture, it kind of almost it sort of upholds this kind of Western classical ideal, which leaves no room for a lot of other people. And in her exhibition at Salon 94, she spoke about black ballet dancers being in this kind of very white dominated culture, where they had to actually hand dye their ballet shoes darker colors because they didn't sell them. And so, again, unearthing all these different things that have almost become the kind of default in our society, but also questioning dynamics between people. What do these stories mean today? And I love this work. This was at the end of her exhibition at Salon 94 last year. She basically made this ballet and recreated the story of Echo and Narcissus, and this idea that if you Narcissus has that there's a mirror somewhere as well in this work. I think it might be on the floor. He's dropped it, and he's just fallen to his he's torn to shreds here. He's fallen into the water. He's killed himself for being so kind of in love with himself, and in a way, Echo and this idea. What do we? I mean, we're all on screens right now, and we're all kind of sinking into our own worlds the whole time in a very kind of odd way. And so I think that this idea of echo narcissism is a very interesting conversation today when so many of us kind of retreat into our black squares because that's kind of how society's behaviors are changing. Um, yeah,
I love that you can see, is that the Brooklyn Bridge behind this piece of art?
I think so. You would know more than me. I'm terrible with my New York bridges.
I think it is. Was there one other you chose?
Yeah, there were lots. Yeah, I
This
love this
one.
work. Holly Lowen, that was really interesting painter who I'd never heard of before, and I loved her work. Just the kind of movement in it, the hands, and the kind of the energy to it. There was a kind of the fact that you can't see the faces enticed me. They could really be anyone. The way that the tennis ball is just slightly up. It's as though we're kind of like about to be on the sort of cusp of something, or the the game or something. And I just thought it was a really interesting show. And yesterday I went to go and see both of Ambera Wellman's exhibitions at Hauser and Wirth and Company. I thought her painting was really interesting. And yes, Shara Hughes. There are so many exhibitions on that I've just loved, and of course the Hilmar Klint, which was a really interesting exhibition. I actually hadn't seen it this time round. I was here in May, and I went on the first day that it opened. And what I loved about this exhibition was, we know Hilmar Klint from the fantastic Guggenheim exhibition, Paintings for the Future, is kind of looking up into the cosmic worlds and skies and looking at how we can understand ourselves from looking up above. But what she did here is she focused on, as she called, the plant-like kingdom, and how actually we can get so many answers from looking at what's beneath us as well. And so I think that's what Hilmar af Klint is so extraordinary about, is getting us to see the world up there but also right in front of us too.
Well, Katie, if we haven't exhausted you, um, Josh, could you take the mic and maybe we could take some questions at this
Yes,
point?
absolutely. Thank you both so much
Thank you.
for that brilliant conversation. I have a few questions here that I will pull up. Um, the first question is coming from Danae. Uh, I don't know if I see you, Danae. Oh, there you are. I'll go ahead and ask you to unmute here, and you can ask your question.
Hi, all. Thank you so much. It's really magical to be kind of in the same Zoom room with you. Quickly, I'm really interested in this concept and would love to hear both of you talking about this idea of greatness in relationship to kind of masculine individual greatness. And if we can reframe that sense of greatness and what constitutes greatness in the everyday act of living and the feminine act of community. Thank you.
Kathy?
I love that you're asking this question because I don't think it's come up before, has it, Katie? To delve into what greatness is?
I think it's really interesting. There's a I got the amazing chance to interview Barbara Kruger for my podcast, and she brought this up idea. She said, what constitutes greatness? What is that thing? And I sort of I wrote this little thing about what I thought that would be like a sort of good response to that. And I, said society's assumptions about what greatness is might not equal what greatness can actually be, especially when we think about how many histories have been erased while others have been prioritized. Because what Kruger said was, she said, this is not to devalue any extraordinary abilities, skills, intelligence, whatever, but just to talk about the inflationary rhetoric that works, that really works to make some people visible and others not. And I think it's this idea that, like, what these, I'm always thinking about challenging this idea of greatness and what greatness means. And, I was sort of programmed growing up in London to think it was kind of these in lots of ways, great art, history painting. The Royal Academy, when it opened in 1768, set these kind of hierarchies that, a history painting was at the top, and portrait painting and embroidery, and that anything that was other than that was at the bottom. And obviously, who did that exclude? Women. But actually, this idea that textiles can be great, embroidery can be great, performance art can be great. And I think that actually it's up to us to change that narrative for ourselves and work together in doing it. Coming back to this Francoise Gillot thing, why do we have to talk about her in relation to a great man? That's a kind of prime example where actually that narrative could have been switched if we dared to kind of just speak to people as intelligent beings like we should. Um, I think we should interrogate greatness. What do you think, Kathy?
Well, I just add on to that. There was a discussion of George O'Keeffe. She was described as a great woman artist, and she said, "No, I am a great artist." And then you added that great woman artist, you would like it to mean an empowered person, period. And I like that. I've been carrying that little definition around with me all summer. Thank you, Katy.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you, Danae.
Yes, thank you so much for that question. Our next question comes from Valeria, and Valeria says, "I'm curious about both speakers' takes on what it means to reassess archives of women artists, and to further build these archives especially. I'm developing a research department for contemporary art in Seattle and confronting a lot of reviews of past group shows of women artists, and the way these shows are reviewed is distinct and too often blatantly sexist and dismissive."
I don't feel that. I feel that in this present time, there are a lot of group shows that happen to be all women artists, and it's never mentioned. So I'm getting a different viewpoint, but as I've been told often, live in a bubble. I'm a lesbian older woman living in Brooklyn, and I know I'm not seeing what a lot of people see and hear. Katy?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think that, definitely when I was looking into, reviews of shows, I mean, you think about the kind of 1993 Whitney Biennale or something, but biannual and these kind of shows that were kind of lots people took people didn't like them for identity politics and etc. And I think that is actually a reflection on um, the person writing it as well, and also the fact that we don't have enough people who are from a wide range of backgrounds writing those reviews. And I think that idea of, the default narrative, whether it's art history, whether it's the media or something, it's still got a long way to change. And I think that it's such a shame because what we want to do is hear all perspectives and also for people to be challenged because sometimes it can also go the other way where people kind of feel pity because it's all not pity but oh it's they kind of think oh my God because we've kind of um we haven't included this person in our history. We have to call them great, even though I don't think this or all these. And actually, that's worse because then that person doesn't get challenged. And I think we need to be honest. But I think honesty comes with a wide range of people contributing so we can all learn from each other. I think it's as important to have those of a wide range of backgrounds in front of the gallery whilst also being behind the gallery or newspaper article, etc., etc.
What does that mean to you behind the gallery?
Well, I think that, I want to see different people writing about art, which obviously happens, but when it comes to the kind of, you know, Titanic, the titans of media, it's often the same. And so I think we should have different perspectives in that way. Does that make sense?
Yes, to me.
All right, our next question is coming from Lila. And Lila asks, what advice would you give to current women artists who are on social media and getting some shows and press coverage to take their work to the next level?
I think that use social media wisely in the sense that don't think that it means real life. I think it's amazing to make connections on it, um, but don't think that just because you have a certain amount of likes that that constitutes a great work of art, or seemingly if you um, don't get any likes on something, it's not a great work of art. I think you use it to build your network, meet people, do studio visits, and, meet your heroes because people, it's an amazing tool to kind of get close to people. I remember when I was 23, I was on my way to New York City and I was at Heathrow and I realized that I was like, oh, I was with my sister and I saw a hero of mine who was Francis Morris, who was the old director of Tate Modern. And I couldn't believe it. My sister was obviously like, who's that? And I was like, my hero anyway. And what I did is I then DM'd her on Instagram and I said, hi, we met. I went up to you at the airport and I said how much I loved your work. What's your email? Can I follow through with this? I think use it like that. And don't think that, yeah, I think use it to build communities, but also save yourself as well. Don't, as Nan Golden said, revolutions don't happen on your phone. Put down your phone and be in the real world.
I just like to add to that that as artists, I feel we're in the business of communication and to pay attention to how what you are making is coming across, both to people who give you a lot of praise and people who are brave enough to tell you what they don't like. I think you need both of them in your world. And I learned the most from my artist friends who told me what was wrong with what I was doing. Now, were they right? Well, I don't know. But the fact is, I remember having to write this on a questionnaire. It says, what has been the biggest event in your life so far, or something? And I wrote change. I had to change. I'm surprised how many artists feel that they don't have to change. I think we have to be acutely aware of how we're coming across and to make a wise step to respond to that.
All right, our next question comes from Charlotte. Charlotte asks, yesterday I spent the afternoon with Gertrude Abercrombie at the Colby College Museum of Art in Maine, an artist who is being rediscovered 50 years after her death. Helen Sheriffbeck, my favorite artist of all time, who died in 1946, will be featured in her first major exhibit in the US next year at the Met. She has long been celebrated in her native Finland. Are there other forgotten women who made art of whom you're particularly excited to see rediscovered?
Oh my gosh. I mean, probably so many. Uh, it's
Now's
interesting.
your chance, Katy. Knight them right at this moment.
Well, what I do is I try and visit young artists and go to, have studio visits for people who also are very at the inception of their career. And I was in Paris and I saw a really extraordinary artist called Talia Maidenberg, who was, in her mid-20s. And I thought that, I again DM'd her on Instagram and was able to meet up with her. And I think that I'm so excited for the kind of younger generation coming through. Um, and I mean, when we think about like, the historical artists as well. I'm such a fan of Gertrude Abercrombie, and I'm sure she's familiar to many people here, but actually, it's just kind of pushing and pushing that name more and more. And I think with someone like Helen Scherfbeck, she had an amazing exhibition at the Royal Academy a few years ago, and that was the first time I'd ever seen her work. And so I think it's extraordinary that these institutions are giving a platform to these artists who should be, they belong in these places.
One of the best shows I saw last season was at the Museum of Modern Art, and it was Keith Kolowitz's etchings. I was very familiar with the very famous ones, but this was showed a lot of her work. And what I didn't realize was that she was so politically involved, that she was protesting, she was doing crowds waving signs and so on, as well as her very intimate work with mothers and children, and and the fact that she was one of the first artists to bring, well, the first thing I knew about her was that she was married to a doctor and she would go to his waiting room and draw the people in his waiting room, waiting to see the doctor. And he wasn't a fancy doctor. I think he took every range of person. So she got these marvelous drawings of working class people. And apparently that was very forward looking for her to do that. And there it was, beautifully portrayed at the Museum of Modern Art. So I think wonderful shows are happening all the time. In your book, Katy, you didn't mention the show at Colby College it also was in Pittsburgh, of Gertrude Abercrombie, because it just happened this summer. Hurrah. Josh, are there any non-female questions?
Our next question comes from an anonymous source.
Definitely non-female.
Um, and it is as follows. From an intersectional lens, any advice for newer art historians and or critics who are still repeatedly coming up against the Eurocentric and white supremacist conditions that, in part, constitute narratives of, in quotes, art history? Not in terms of speaking to what you are not familiar with, but in terms regularly hitting up against paradigms that are so entrenched. How to not get discouraged too often, or particularly in current political and economic eras.
I mean, I think the best thing you can do is it might sound, I don't know, but I think it's talk to artists. I think that's how I've not only learnt my education by asking artists about them, but also asking artists about other artists they know, but also them sort of giving me permission to write in my own sort of style and way. And I think, I think if you're interested in it, people will follow, and you've got to work out the best way for you to execute that. I'm not an academic at all, so I don't work in that kind of style. My way is, podcasts and my Instagram and my talks, and it's sort of much more conversational, and that's what I like, and that's what I think, is my strength. But I think that, and actually, you can also do that. That there are no kind of right or wrong ways to write in a certain way or be in a certain way. So I think, if anything, I get so much of the way that I've been able to do my work is through reading great writers who have always done something slightly different, have taken a different approach, or speaking to artists, if that makes sense, if that answers the question.
This reminds me of something that I wanted to say, um, was that there was a study recently, and it showed that college students who majored in history of art got more employment than college students who majored in computer science. This, I think, was in Hyperallergic article. Did you ever hear about that, Katy? It was recent.
No, but that's so interesting.
Well, there was a reason. There was a catch, kind of. The history of art majors didn't necessarily go out into the world being history of art academics. They fashioned very creatively a future for themselves and employment that might have been uh, out of the box. And what I've seen you do, you're definitely not an academic. You took that history of art degree and pounded on what you thought was important to get out into the world, whether it was going to pay you or not. I think you took a risk. You started the Instagram account, which, as you've pointed out, is free. But that led to publishing a book, which I understand has been published in 17 languages. One time you were being interviewed in Australia, and the interviewer announced that, and the entire auditorium burst into applause. And I agree. I think that's really extraordinary. And what it told me was that Katy had very creatively fashioned a life as an art historian, and it's still growing. She has a number of books in the pipeline, which we could talk about later, but maybe there's some more wonderful questions.
I was just going to say as well, there's a great quote from Ruth Asawa, who was one of my favorite artists, sadly not alive anymore, who made these incredible kind of looped wired sculptures that would just step, they're all just stem from a single entity that's wired, but she kind of transforms them into something extraordinary.
And she's about to have big shows now.
Yeah, and she was at Black Mountain College, which was this amazing institution in the 50s that was only active for not for just over a decade, but really was sort of spearheaded by Joseph and Annie Albers. And she said, Ruth Asawa said, art will make people better, more highly skilled in thinking and improving whatever business one goes into or whatever occupation it makes a person broader. And I think that, no matter what art perhaps there are some accountants here, or there are some hairdressers, or there are some lawyers, or anything, or artists, or anything. I think that we can apply all that artistic thinking to, that kind of slow looking, that paying attention, that element of surprise, that painting's rewarding us because we've put that effort in. Learning about histories, understanding cultures because you're really looking at that point of view and what was happening there and then. That is what I think Ruth Asar was getting to the bottom of, which actually allows us to do so many different things. I mean, this idea that, what she did in the San Francisco schools, as well as she had this program where she would get young kids to make what she had, like, I think she called like baker's clay, and she gave them flour, water, and salt, and just to make like a little sculpture which they then baked. And it's this idea that, if you show a child or an adult that they can just make something with their hands, they can create something beautiful. Like, what else are they capable of doing? And I think that, like that sense of giving someone agency, is what art and art education can do, which is why it can apply to so many different things.
I hope what you just said gets dispersed out into the world.
All right, we have one final question before we move into the reading. And this question comes from Fong. Fong, if I can find you, which if you would like to unmute yourself, there you are.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you. Congratulations, Katy.
Thank
And
you. Hello, lovely to meet you.
we meet you. We're able to bring imminent warmth to a cold form of technology. And that's our most urgent thing. Talking about social media, Kathy is a master Instagrammer. And I think anybody who's interested in social media should take lesson and checking out Kathy Bradford's Instagram. I check them out all the time. I'm learning. I think the whole thing with social media is just the tool. If we know how to bring warmth and share the great warmth, which is the made object, and share not just our own work, but other people's work, things that you see, things that you heard. And I think that's a very, very healthy way to go about it. So I have a quick question, Katy. Everything had to do with liberal democracy, as we know at the moment. It requires patience, and we're not so patient at the moment. That's why following the work of art and being impatient as you are, as some of us are, there's no reason to keep the work what we do in the academy, because the academy have proven to be incredible machine. It's almost like sport industry and a military industry. So it's nice to be able to find the space, work outside of it. And that's proved to be impatiently patient in some odd way. So I think the work you do is terrific, and you expanding this, what I would reference in Robert Putnam, who think there's two kind of social capital. There's social bonding capital, that you tend to create friends who look like you, sharing the same background, upbringing, and whatnot, which can be very detrimental, like the way that when Germany was severely punished by the Versailles treaties, you can imagine frustrated young German men, maybe a little bit angry too. It's easily to be exploited, which is what happened with Hitler. Same thing that we can say our current president doing the same. But the other thing that what we're doing here, which is so much tied to what you do, what Kathy's been doing, all of us here, is social bridging capital. We're doing the bridging. We created network with new friends, new artists, and our impatientness proven to be very effective. That's not a question, is it? All right, what is my question? I'm going to do it right now. Woman Without Man. That was a great film that Serena Sat did in 2009 with her partner, Soja Ajari, based on the novel written in 1990 about the 53 American coup supported to bring the Shah to power. And Shanut Pasapur wrote the novel that turned into a movie. And I wonder whether your book have some reference to that great film, Woman Without Man.
It doesn't. But it's a great comparison. Um, no, it doesn't.
Well, that's good. That's very simple. Well,
Fawn, could I just do a little bridging here?
yes, please.
I know a marvelous archivist who would really like to come in and organize your office here.
Oh, cool. Okay, okay. I'm so messy, what you mean? Is that the criticism from my friend
It's
Katherine
just
Bradford?
wonderfully full. And how can you keep it all straight?
It
Anyway,
hasn't been easy. It hasn't been easy. But we
I
do
can,
the best we can, Kathy. Please text me the name, and then we can talk further. But Katie, great work. Congratulations. I just ordered the book, and be agile and be incredibly as fearless you have been. It's a profound contribution you're making. And I'm glad that my old friend Kathy here is having such a great time, this conversation with you, and everybody is enjoying it, you can see. So thank you. And back to you, Josh.
Thank you so much as well. I mean, I stand on all the shoulders of people who have, broken, uh, you know, they've challenged the status quo. They've created new ways of doing things. So thank you as well.
Thank you both, Catherine and Katie, for your thoughtful responses to those questions and everyone who asked a question. Today, our event will end with a poetry reading. And so, Catherine, I'll pass the mic back over to you to introduce the poem.
we have a very special poem today, and I'd just like to add that in America, this is a day of remembrance, being September 11th. We're not touching on that. This is a poem by Zoe Leonard. It was written in 1992. I want a dyke for president. She wrote it in response to Eileen Miles, who ran for president, put herself up as a candidate, and I think it inspired Zoe Leonard to sit down and type out this wonderful poem, which our marvelous guest, Katy Hessel, is going to read for you.
I Want a President by Zoe Leonard, 1992. I want a dyke for president. I want a person with AIDS for president. And I want a fag for vice president. And I want someone with no health insurance. And I want someone who grew up in a place where the earth is so saturated with toxic waste that they didn't have a choice about getting leukemia. I want a president that had an abortion at 16, and I want a candidate who isn't the lesser of two evils, and I want a president who lost their last lover to AIDS, who still sees that in their eyes every time they lay down to rest, who held their lover in their arms and knew they were dying. I want a president with no air conditioning, a president who has stood on the line at the clinic, at the DMV, at the welfare office, and has been unemployed and laid off and sexually harassed and gay bashed and deported. I want someone who has spent the night in the tombs and had a cross burnt on their lawn and survived rape. I want someone who has been in love and been hurt, who respects sex, who has made mistakes and learned from them. I want a black woman for president. I want someone with bad teeth, someone who has eaten hospital food, someone who cross-dresses and has done drugs and been in therapy. I want someone who has committed civil disobedience. And I want to know why this isn't possible. I want to know why we started learning somewhere down the line that a president is always a clown, always a John and never a hooker, always a boss and never a worker, always a liar, always a thief, and never caught.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much, Katie, for reading that poem and sharing that with us. And thank you for this brilliant conversation. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art and Tiger Foundation for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 25 years. A donation directly supports our writers, production staff, and operations. Support our work through the link in the chat. And join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Josh Bardfield, Dan Colin, Sarah Workneh, Alvaro Barrington, Neville Wakefield, Anna Imhoff, and Eleanor Hartney on the event of Sky High Farms' biennial exhibition, Trees Never End and Houses Never End. And as is Rail tradition, we invite everyone now to turn on their mics and say hello and goodbye as they leave.
Hello,
Thank
hello,
you
goodbye.
so
Thank
much.
Thank you.
Thank
You
you.
both.
Thank you,
Thank
Katie.
you,
Katie and
today.
Kathy.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye,
Katie.
Kathy.
That was amazing.
Great, great
Yes.
conversation. Can't wait to share it with
Wonderful.
everyone I know.
Thank
I'm
you.
really
Thank
distracted
you.
now.
Bye bye.
Um,
Congratulations on the book.
Buy the books, everybody.
Bye.
Let's buy the book.